it is Batman's 82-year anniversary, how will you be celebrating the Caped Crusaders' wonderful history in DC Comics? Personally, I will probably watch the Batman the Animated Series, read a couple of comics, and of course, just gush about how amazing the Batman is on all of history of the Batman social media. So it should be a fun day. Welcome back, Gothamites. If you're new here, hi. I'm London, aka History of the Batman. So this week, specifically on Tuesday, March 30th, fingers crossed I actually get this video out on March 30th, but we'll see, is a very, very important day for us Batman fans. Probably the most important day in Batman's entire existence, because on March 30th, 1939, the Batman debuted in Bill Finger's story, The Case of the Chemical Syndicate, which was in Detective Comics issue 27. And while we celebrate the Detective Comics publication practically every day, Detective Comics in its own right is such an iconic and historic comic book publication all by itself. Not only does it hold the record for being the longest running American comic book with 881 issues, which was from 1937 to 2011, but the publication has produced so many incredible and important stories, not just tied to the Batman mythology, but all of DC Comics history. And I couldn't think of a better way this year to celebrate the Batman's wonderful anniversary than to talk about some stellar Detective Comics stories. So, because Detective Comics issue 27 is where our Batman journey began 82 years ago, I will be telling you 27 of the most important, memorable, and really iconic Detective Comics stories that of course revolve around the Dark Knight himself. Now, I'm just putting this disclaimer out here right now. Just last week, Detective Comics issue 1034 hit comic book stands. So I am only highlighting 27 single issues or arcs that are all within the Detective Comics publication. I'm sure someone out there, or maybe you watching this, will say, hey, what about so-and-so story? Why wasn't this highlighted in this video? And I'm just gonna say right now, it is not because it is not an important or great or memorable story. I'm just trying to do a chronological, brief retrospect of different stories from all the different eras that I think you guys should check out. Whether you've read them before, I say read them again, or maybe you'll find a story that's brand new and you can add it to your own Batman collection. To celebrate the Batman's birthday, why don't you check these stories out? But before we begin this very nerdy celebration of the Caped Crusader, why don't you subscribe to this channel right there and become part of this wonderful Gothamite community. Now, the first is, of course, the debut issue of not only Bruce Wayne's Batman, but also Commissioner James Gordon, and that is in Bill Finger's The Case of the Chemical Syndicate, which was in Detective Comics issue 27, which was published on March 30th, 1939. I love this story. You get a look at the very raw version of the Batman, and also you get the purple gloves, you look at the little red coupe he's driving because we're not rolling in the Batmobile yet. It is all very pure golden age goodness, and it's the very first story that Batman was ever in DC Comics. Our second story is from 1939 Detective Comics issue 31 and 32, and that is Batman vs. the Vampire parts 1 and 2. Not only is this technically the very first arc that the Batman has ever had in his entire history, but we are also introduced to not only Julie Madison, who was Bruce Wayne's fiance at the time, and technically the very first love interest of the Dark Knight, that of course will not work out because most of the time, literally most of the time, Batman's love life just is problematic. But the story also debuts the first time we see the Batarang, which of course is Batman's most well-known, or arguably most well-known weapon that he's had in not only comics but also film, TV, video games, and everything you've seen Batman in. he has a batarang on him. It's just will always be iconic. Gardner Fox, Bob Kane, and Sheldon Moldoff's 2-issue arc is once again a great, fantastic representation of Batman's first literal year in Detective Comics. His first time out on these streets of this metropolis, because it's not called Gotham City yet, because that is in 1941. But anyway, and he gets to go up against supernatural beings, which love to see it. And this iconic cover that has been homaged by, of course, Neil Adams in the beginning of the 1970s, especially when you get into that transitional period of the Bronze Age, where we actually go back and use the visuals from this Golden Age era. It is all simply important for you to read and check out. It all is. Our third story is from 1940's Detective Comics issue 38, and that is in Bill Finger's story Batman and Robin the Boy Wonder, which has both Dick Grayson and the Robin mantle debuting for the first time. And once Robin the Boy Wonder is within Batman stories, especially going into the soon, at the time, published beginning of the Batman publication, which was in spring of 1940, technically April 25th, 1940, if you want to be super specific about it. And that takes Batman out of his literal first year in DC Comics and kind of this very Pulp Fiction, dark, wielding a gun, killing enemies, very noir persona. The purpose of Robin was not only to give balance to this very dark side of the Dark Knight, but also to appeal to a younger audience, really popularizing the sidekick role in the American comic book. Yes, Robin Dick Grayson is iconic. Are we shocked? You shouldn't be. Our fourth story is from 1941's Detective Comics issue 58, and that is in Bill Finger's story, one of the most perfect frame-ups. And this issue is important because it debuts the gentleman of crime, the Penguin. The Penguin is celebrating his 80th anniversary this year, and honestly, I love this villain in all media. Our next story is in 1942's Detective Comics issue 66, and this is another debut of a classic Batman villain, and that is Harvey Kent at the time. A couple issues later, he would be Harvey Dent, but this is where we see him transform into the villain Two-Face. In another Bill Finger classic, The Crimes of Two-Face, which was illustrated by Bob Kane. Our next one is a gem from 1948, and that was published in Detective Comics issue 140, and we have another debut. I promise not all of these issues or arcs are just going to be debuts. It's mixed up here and there, but the early books, they just are a breeding ground to put in all these amazing characters into this very new mythos, so bear with me here. But this story, written by Bill Finger and illustrated by Dick Sprang and Charles Paris, is called Batman the Riddler because it is the first time we are introduced to Edward Nygma's Riddler. Now, this story is really cool because unlike most other debuts within this Golden Age era, this is one of the first time that you have a debut that gives the origin story of the villain. Now, another example of this within this era could be Jonathan Crane's Scarecrow, who debuted in World's Finest Comic issue number 3, and he is given an origin story as well, but this wasn't necessarily commonplace in these stories. So once again, another Golden Age gem. Definitely recommend you checking it out. Ooh, our next story is from 1951's Detective Comics issue 168. And this is Bill Finger, Lou Sayer Schwartz, and Win Mortimer's story, The Man Behind the Red Hood. Yes, this is the very first time that we see the Red Hood persona, which is taken up by the Clown Prince of Crime himself, the Joker, in any comics. In later comics, this story is given a more modern interpretation, from Alan Moore and Brian Boland's one-shot Batman the Killing Joke, to even the character Jason Todd taking up the Red Hood mantle later in the early 2000s. If you are a fan of the Red Hood character, Detective Comics 168 is literally an essential for you to read. Our next story is from 1956 Detective Comics issue 233, and this is an Edward Hamilton and Sheldon Moldoff story called The Batwoman. And yes, this is the first time that the Batwoman mantle is introduced in DC Comics. The writers and editors of the Batman mythos at the time wanted to give a more traditional family feel to the Caped Crusader and the Boy Wonder's entire universe, especially since very false accusations had been applied from psychiatrist Frederick Wortham, saying that Batman and Robin's dynamic wasn't a father-son relationship, but more of a homoerotic one. scaring all the parents, thinking, oh my god, our kids that are reading comics are gonna become juvenile delinquents, and what should we do? So introducing characters from Batwoman to even the first Batgirl and Betty Kane, and even adding a good family dog into the mix in Ace the Bat Hound really gave the family feel that in the 1950s parents and other adults really wanted to have for their kids. They wanted that representation. So Batwoman was kind of a start in that. I think that while them being created was funny just because of the context of what was happening in the time period of Wortham's book and the introduction of the Comics Code Authority and all of that jazz, I think this story is very important to know just to understand a roundabout history, especially an out-of-universe history of the Batman comics themselves. Love stuff like that. Our next story is from 1961, Detective Comics issue 298, and this isn't the first debut of Clayface, but of Matt Hagen's Clayface. And another Finger classic, The Challenge of Clayface. Our 10th story is from 1964's Detective Comics issue 327, and oh my gosh, one of my favorite stories to come out of the 1960s. And this is John Byrne, Carmine Infantino, Joe Guerra, and Gaspar Saladino, I believe. That sounds right. Mystery of the Menacing Mask. Now, while this is a very fun detective story centered around Batman and Robin, this particular comic is important because it introduced the new look of the Batman in 1964. And that is the first time you see the yellow oval chest emblem on the Batsuit. That will transfer over into the following 1966 TV series and all of the other media for at least the next 30, 40 years. Batman's chest emblem really hadn't been dramatically changed as in adding this bright yellow color ever since his debut in 1939. Really, my favorite Bat emblem because I'm just a pop fiend, so love me some color. Our next story is another Bill Finger and Sheldon Moldoff classic, and that is the Gotham Gang lineup, published in 1964's Detective Comics issue 328. This story is important because it is the first time that our wonderful butler, father figure, all around best Batman family character besides Bruce Wayne ever, Alfred Pennyworth, dies in DC Comics, and kind of like the other characters that we mentioned from Batwoman to the first Batgirl to even Batmite, those characters kind of started to slowly go away, and they thought Alfred needs to kick the bucket too. They're like, we have way too many people in the Batman family, which is hilarious to think about right now because there are so many people in the current Batman family. But they thought, oh, we should kill him off, and Alfred loses his life trying to protect Batman and Robin like the good father he is. But as we may or may not know, once the 1966 Batman TV series aired and became a cultural phenomenon, which did include Alan Napier portraying Alfred Pennyworth in the TV series, his popularity came back and people were like, we want Alfred back in the comics. In a very interesting way, they made Alfred this villain called the Outsider, which looks like a very kind of bootleg thing from Fantastic Four. I don't know, it's fine. But he's turned back into Alfred and all is right with the world and he's not dead anymore because it's comics and you could totally do that. But yes, I'm still sad that as of this moment, Alfred is still dead. I really don't like it, at all, but it's fine. If you want to see Alfred's first canonical death, then there you go. Ooh, oh yeah, I love this one. This is from 1967 Detective Comics issue 359. You guessed it, my girl, Barbara Gordon, aka Batgirl, the new revamped Batgirl, because as I was saying, the first Batgirl really didn't represent, especially at this time in the 1960s, the female empowerment movement, because literally Batgirl and Batwoman were made just to be kind of girlfriends to Batman and Robin, and that ain't it, you know? So Commissioner Gordon's daughter becomes the new Batgirl of Gotham City, and that is in the iconic Gardner Fox, Carmine Infantino, Gaspar Saladino story. That is an important issue, not just for Batman, but just Babs. I love Babs. Babs is literally my heart and soul. I love her so much. I had an original copy of Detective Comics 359, but when all my comics were stolen, well, about like 95% of them, that issue was gone as well. So that's probably the one thing that it's going to take me a while to get a copy of, but my pride and joy. The $1 Million debut of Batgirl. Please read it. Ooh, we're going into the good old Bronze Age of the 1970s, and of course it is fitting to start with 1970s Detective Comics issue 400, which is Frank Robbins, Neil Adams, and Dick Giordano's story, Challenge of the Man-Bat, and yes, that is the debut of Kirk Langstrom's Man-Bat. The 1970s, as I said, was an important period for the Batman because he went back to his gothic roots that Bill Finger and Bob Kane introduced all the way back in 1939 because they wanted to step away from the very campy aesthetic that the Batman 66 TV show introduced. The DC editors and creators from Neil Adams and Frank Robbins and Dick Giordano and Denny O'Neil and all these other amazing writers and artists wanted to bring back this kind of noir feel to Batman stories, and stories like Challenge of the Man-Bat definitely is a testament to this transformative era, so I recommend. This next story is a Lynn Wein and Marv Wolfman classic story from the early 1970s. And this is from 1971's Detective Comics issue 408, and that is The House That Haunted Batman. And simply as it sounds, it really is a haunted house story, a mystery slash haunted house story slash ghost story that I think is so cool to have, especially since we are in this kind of transformative era where many supernatural stories aren't really the vibe anymore, but it just fit to have him in this kind of state of really disarray. Lynn Wein, Marv Wolfman, fantastic writers. You'll love it, I promise. Oh, one of my favorite Denny O'Neil stories of all time, and he has written so many incredible stories, not just Batman stories, but just in general, comic stories. And that is There Is No Hope in Crime Alley, which was originally published in 1976, Detective Comics issue 457. I have talked about this story many times on this channel. In particular, I did a 5-minute Bat history about Crime Alley. Not only do you get the debut of Leslie Tompkins, but you also do get the debut of the place where Batman's parents, Thomas and Martha Wayne, were gunned down, called Crime Alley. But originally, this area within Batman's tragic origin story was called Park Row. So Crime Alley got its birth in this Detective Comics comic. Iconic. I of course recommend. Oh, this next story, Steve Englehart, Marshall Rogers, Terry Austin, just, it's so good. This is The Laughing Fish, one of the most essential Joker stories you will ever read, which was originally published in 1978's Detective Comics issue 475. Even if you haven't read The Laughing Fish, maybe you've seen the Batman animated series episode that has the same name called The Laughing Fish, and it is just a gem within the larger Strange Apparitions arc, which is, I have said, I know many times on this channel, one of the most important, essential, must-read Batman arcs in his entire 82-year history. It is just pure Bronze Age goodness. Our 17th, I believe, story, moving on into the 1980s, is from 1981's Detective Comics issue 500. And that is an Alan Brenner and Dick Giordano story, To Kill a Legend, which is a story that included in the special anniversary issue that sees Batman attempting to save the life of his parents being gunned down on another Earth. I appreciate the epilogue of this story because it shows that even if this tragedy didn't happen to a young Bruce Wayne, he would still be inspired in some way to become the Dark Knight, even if it isn't wrapped up in a tragic moment. Bruce Wayne's fate and destiny is to become the Dark Knight. I love stories like that. To Kill a Legend, so extraordinary. Oh, this next one, Mike W. Barr, Alan Davis, incredible arc which is Batman Year 2, which originally started in 1987 Detective Comics issue 575. This story, which I know I have discussed in particular in the 5-minute Bat history about Joe Chill, shows that Batman and Joe Chill, the man who gunned down Bruce Wayne's parents, have to work together to stop the Reaper. What is something that people have discussed many times, especially dealing with the history between Batman and using guns, is that on all of these covers, Batman is holding a gun because in the story, Batman feels like he should not only kill Joe Chill for what he did to his parents, but also use the same gun that he used to kill them. Of course, in the end, Batman doesn't, but he sure does threaten them. He sure is real close. Batman Year 2, a very good Batman story that focuses on the kind of guilt that Batman harbors around the death of his parents and having to face the one man that took his parents away from him. It's real deep and action-packed. Love the art. It's a great arc. This next 2-issue arc is an Alan Grant and Norm Brayfogle classic story called Anarchy in Gotham City, and it debuts the awesome villain Anarchy. And that is in the pages of Detective Comics 608 to 609. Our next story is a Chuck Dixon and Graham Nolan really cool 0-hour tie-in. It is called Yesterday's Gone, and that is in 1994's Detective Comics issue 678. And I know that I have discussed this story in a video that I focused on what if Batman's parents didn't die, and highlighted different stories that do showcase Batman being able to come face to face with his parents, whether before they died or while they died. They come back in visions, and how that really affects the Batman in current time. And Yesterday's Gone is a very good story. And also this cover is just simply iconic. Another great story that really gives a focus on Commissioner James Gordon and the GCPD is called The Honored Dead. It's a Greg Rucka story from 2000's Detective Comics issue 742. Sean Martinbro's art, I really love it. I love the textures of the lines, everything. I am a big fan of when we focus on Gordon and the GCPD and other people in Gotham that help the Batman protect the city, and it's not just a full focus on the Dark Knight. Granted, we love Batman. That's why we read these stories. However, it's good to see other Gothamites within Batman's world and how they are affected by certain events. So, The Honored Dead, totally a recommend story. Oh, this next one is literally one of my favorite Paul Dini stories. It is also illustrated by Dustin Nguyen and Derek Verdolf, and I absolutely love any comic that they do, not even just Batman, just anything. And that is, of course, the 5-issue arc Heart of Hush, which was published in 2009's Detective Comics 846 to 850, which acts as more of a follow-up to the early 2000s arc Batman Hush by Jeff Loeb, which introduced Thomas Elliot's Hush, who of course wants to ruin Bruce Wayne and Batman's life. And this is no different in Heart of Hush, where he wants to try to attack the Batman by, of course, attacking the one person he truly loves in his life, and that is Selena Kyle's Catwoman. The art is outstanding. The story itself is so fantastic. I mean, it's a Paul Dini story. What do you expect? Please read Heart of Hush. Even if Hush isn't your favorite Batman villain, you get some Scarecrow in there, and it's just a good time. Please read this Premiere 52 story. It's great. Oh, the next is a gem. Neil Gaiman's Part 2 to the 2-issue arc, Whatever Happened to the Caped Crusader. Part 2 was published in 2009's Detective Comics 853, and these two comics discuss the aftermath of Bruce Wayne's apparent death by Darkseid and Grant Morrison's arc Final Crisis. Coming down to the wire here, I think this is our 24th recommended Detective Comics story, and this is an important one because it is Scott Snyder's very first Batman story. This one, illustrated by Jock and Francesco Francavilla, is Batman the Black Mirror, which is a focus on Dick Grayson's Batman, and oh, I love it so much. And this was published in 2011's Detective Comics issue 871 to 881. The story is basically the last big arc before the new 52 kicks in September 2011, and everything is revamped and started over and all of that jazz, but it is a great story to round out the classic era of the Detective Comics issues. And speaking of which, our next story is, of course, Detective Comics issue number 1 from 2011, which kickstarts the New 52. These first Detective Comics stories were written and illustrated by Tony S. Daniel, and I'm sure that you are familiar with how the Joker takes off his face and sticks it on the Arkham Asylum wall, and then he disappears and then returns as this real extra crazy Joker, particularly in Scott Snyder and Greg Capullo's follow-up story, Death of the Family. If you want to kickstart the second volume, technically, of Detective Comics, this Tony S. Daniel arc focusing on the Joker and his kind of rebirth, which I remember when this first came out, everyone was like, what is all this? Why does he look like that? That's scary as hell. I recommend. Our second to last arc is from James Tynion IV, and that is The Rise of the Batman, which is from 2016 Detective Comics issue 934 to 940. This arc starts the new Batman family, and in particular, Batman and Kate Kane's Batwoman leading. It even has Clayface as part of the Bat family. And it's really a great story that kind of kickstarts the DC Rebirth tales within Detective Comics. And of course, our 27th recommended Detective Comics is Detective Comics 1000, which came out in 2019, celebrating the 80th anniversary of the Batman, and of course, really the 80th anniversary of Batman in Detective Comics. Yes, since we just talked about a whole bunch of these different stories, if you want to read a lot of the stories that I discussed, a lot of them are in this trade that came out in 2019, which celebrates the Batman and Detective Comics 80th anniversary. If you are interested in purchasing it, if you don't have it in your collection, I really recommend it. I'll put it in the description below. But there are so many short stories in Detective Comics 1000 that are amazing, so I'm really just recommending this entire like 92-page formatted book to you. Read it all. It's all a celebration of the Batman and the Bat family and just his mythology over the then past 80 years. And there are just so many stories in this publication and the Batman publication and all of the other books that Batman has graced over the last 82 years. You just can't get enough of fantastic Batman stories. And I recommend these 27 to celebrate Batman's debut in Detective Comics 27. And there are so many more amazing detective tales. Read as many as you can, but I do hope that you enjoyed learning more about the Detective Comics publication and many standout issues and stories that feature the Caped Crusader over his 8 decades in DC Comics. Thank you guys so much for watching this video, giving you the best 27 stories within the Detective Comics publication, celebrating the Batman's birthday, or anniversary, or debut, or however you want to call it. What is your favorite Detective Comics story? It doesn't have to be ones that I mentioned in this video. It could be any story that has been in the Detective Comics publication. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a bat thumbs up. As always, all of my social media is linked in the description below, including Instagram at History of the Batman. So why don't you give it a follow and become a Gothamite? Check out the rest of my Batman videos on this channel. And of course, please subscribe to this channel so you can become part of this Batman community. It would mean so much to me. Thank you guys so much for watching. I have much more Batman planned for this channel. I'm just slowly getting it out there. I'm still recovering. I'm so much better now. And I also want to say thank you to everyone who left comments and messaged me asking how my recovery is going from surgery. I really, really appreciate you guys caring, like at all. And I'm doing so much better. And it's a daily process, but I'll be good as new very soon. We will have much more History of the Batman right here on YouTube. So stay tuned. Thank you so much for watching. And remember, it's all about peace, love, and Batman. Bye, guys.